Hi, everyone, and welcome to MedEdge. I'm Marcus Grimm. Wow, you can't tell this because the last episode of MedEdge just came out 2 weeks ago for you, but I'm going to let you in on a little bit of secret here. This is actually sort of our season 2 premiere on this one. The team has been taking a few months off as we've brought in a bunch of great new visitors and guests to this show, and we've got a whole great slate of season 2 programming coming at you. I am thrilled to be back. The rest of the MedEdge team is thrilled to be back. So let's get into it. Quick reminder, MedEdge, of course, is brought to you by Metrics. Metrics is the premier platform for student, resident, faculty, and administration engagement software for undergraduate, graduate, veterinarian, and yes, nursing. We're going to be talking to someone who's in nursing education today, which I'm thrilled about. You can learn more about Metrics at metricslab.com or from my frequent co-host, Metrics CEO Santosh Cherian. But not today. Tosh is taking care of those customers, and we do appreciate it. You know, we spent a lot of time on MedEdge talking about how to better prepare medical students and residents for careers in healthcare. Likewise, we dedicate time and resources to looking at technologies that save faculty and administrators time so they can put more focus into that important business of education. Yet, what we haven't talked about until today are different ways that we can make sure those educators are absolutely as dialed in as possible and are succeeding to their greatest potential. So joining us today on MedEdge is Dr. Laura Klenke-Borgmann, a leading voice in nursing education and simulation with nearly 15 years of experience in both undergraduate and graduate nursing programs. Dr. Klenke-Borgmann is the Director of Simulation Education at the University of Kansas School of Nursing and a clinical associate professor. Dr. Borgmann is passionate about using innovative teaching methods like simulation to bridge the gap between classroom learning and real-world practice for nursing students. Her expertise in this area is widely recognized. We're so thrilled to have her here today. Her recent publication on clinical judgment transferability through simulation was named, get this, the 2023 Research Article of the Year by Clinical Simulation in Nursing. Now, in addition to this work, she's one of the co-authors of a February 2023 article in Nurse Educator, which was titled, A Scoping Review of Nurse Educator Competencies, Mind the Gap. Now, she was very quick to tell me she wasn't the lead author on this. She's one of the co-authors on this, but we're thrilled to get her perspective from being involved with this project. Laura, welcome to MedEdge.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
We are thrilled to have you on this program. And I'm going to be diving into a lot of the questions about this particular paper you were involved with. But I want to give you the ability. You mentioned that you weren't the lead author on this. There were some other co-authors. Who all do you want to make sure gets credit for this project? 'Cause it's a really cool one.
Yeah, absolutely. So the lead author is Dr. Elizabeth Wells-Beatty. She's the one who kind of came up with this and brought the idea to me at a national convention that we were all at one year talking about, we're focusing so much on the competencies of our nursing students as they graduate and as they enter into practice. But whoa, are we sure that we as educators are also competent in getting them there? And so it was just a really fascinating idea and fascinating sort of vision for this article that she then reached out to me to be on the project with, along with other giants in the field, Dr. Patricia Sharpnack, Dr. Darla Grubin, Dr. Caitlin Yeager, and Dr. Laura Goliath. So it was a big group of people from around the country with different perspectives, but yet we all have the same experience of maybe that lack of development of the nurse educators as well as our nursing students.
Terrific. Well, we're going to be diving into that today, and yeah, that's a star-studded team that you were with. So we appreciate you taking the time to share that with us today. Now, we are going to dig into the paper, but let's face it, sim labs are really cool. And I just saw on LinkedIn, this is a LinkedIn post from a week ago. You posted this photo with this caption. Whew, and then a couple emojis. Record-setting day in the University of Kansas School of Nursing Simulation Labor and Delivery Unit. 1 sim director, 2 midwifery faculty, 2 graduate teaching assistants, 6 midwifery students, 1 Laerdal medical sim mom, and 27 successful births.
Yeah.
I'm assuming the record was for the number of simulation births, but I'm not sure. So just tell us about that, because it seems like you all had a lot of fun.
Yeah, we had a great day. It was a really fun, very busy day. Our midwifery program here at the University of Kansas is oftentimes a lot of the students are remote. They're taking a lot of their courses online. So there's really only just a few days every semester that they all come together here on campus in our simulation lab to do a lot of the hands-on immersive learning that we want our midwifery students to get. And so we had this very, very full day of the 6 of the midwifery students here on campus, learning all about, or practicing really, all about complicated births. So shoulder dystocia, cord around the neck, hands and knees births that the mom's on her hands and knees. So we just I'm very passionate about immersive learning and also repetitive practice. And so they all got lots and lots and lots of experience with all of those different types of complicated births throughout a short period of time, a day. So, our poor sim mom, she was busy. She had 27 babies that day.
That's amazing. 27 is that's the most you've ever done in a day?
Oh, I think so. I definitely think, we've done multiples before, but I think 27 is the record. Yeah.
That is so cool. And we're going to have you back to just talk about sim labs in general, because wow, it's a fascinating topic. And, it's one, you must love your job to just being at the middle of that.
I do. Yep. There's always, there's always room for creativity and innovation. And, like I said before, I'm just super passionate about immersing people in learning, and simulation's definitely, one way to do that well.
That is amazing. We have my wife and I have 2 children, and to imagine 27 in a day, that's a lot. All right, let's change topics here. You said it yourself. So much of the conversation of late in medical education has been around this idea of competency-based learning. Obviously, competency-based learning, it's standard for GME these days. We're seeing it predictably moving down into the path of UME. We're seeing a lot more conversation about that. The AACN Essentials is doing the same for nursing education. But this is interesting. The recent paper you were involved with in Nurse Educator, a scoping review of nurse educator competencies, not the nursing students themselves, but the nurse educator competencies, mind the gap. This highlights this critical issue, the lack of clear guidance on preparing effective nursing educators. So we spend so much energy into making sure we can train our doctors, train our nurses, but, are we training our trainers? Could you elaborate on this gap and the potential consequences for nursing education as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, competency-based education has been around a while, especially in medical education, as you mentioned. It's a little bit of a newer trend and topic in nursing education because, as you mentioned, the 2021 AACN Essentials came out basically saying as such, right, that we need to make sure that we transition our nursing education to focus more on, and I love this about competency education, to focus more on the output. So basically what our learners are able to do and what they're able to show us versus the input. So, but what we say and do as educators and, our lesson plans and our objectives and things like that. And I really, really love that about competency-based education, that it's the output that we're focusing on, not what we're putting in as educators. But to that point, it's very different. It kind of flies a bit in the face of what we as educators have kind of always been used to, or maybe what we were taught in, our own training. And so again, that's kind of where the origin story of this article even came from, was a bunch of us educators at a national conference saying, yeah, we have to make sure that our students are so competent, but are we sure that we are? Right? Which is kind of scary to say. And we were a little worried we might, make some people mad.
Right. Well, let me ask you about that because it's interesting. Obviously, the NLN has identified these 8 core competencies, if you will.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, and I'm curious, somebody like yourself, you and your colleagues in nurse education, I find oftentimes, people are extremely familiar with those core competencies for the students. But what is the familiarity of those 8 core competencies for the nursing educators? Are we as familiar with them?
No, not really. In my opinion. And, the NLN does have the Certified Nurse Educator certification. That is, that the certification basically looks at those competencies and those core things. But unless you have sat for the exam or are studying for the exam or have been around that for one reason or another, it's not necessarily something that we're always talking about or that we're always, reviewing in faculty meetings or talking about in terms of professional development. So honestly, I don't know how familiar, on a broad scale people are with those.
Right. So you talk about familiarity, and then of course, if we don't have the familiarity, I automatically go to, well, how do we even operationalize this, right? Like, so one of the things that's really been interesting as the competencies come into education, we're seeing that a lot now, more with metrics in the software. How do we map these competencies to the different lessons that we have? But how do you do that at the instructor level? What does operationalizing this even look like? Can you give us some examples of how you might measure these?
You're kind of drilling down to exactly what our article was talking about, and in that sort of mind the gap part of the title, is that yes, people are maybe aware of the core competencies, but how are they actually getting operationalized, and are they? The way that they would get operationalized would be through, robust and rigorous professional development of faculty, through mentoring, again, structured kind of formal mentoring programs, that a lot of schools maybe don't have or don't have time to do or aren't fully fleshed out. And then, just continuing kind of spot checks of the standards and the quality and the basically the operationalization of what's happening. Those are all some of the low-hanging fruit, I think, that you could sort of say could be the way that those things are operationalized, but with time limits and budget limits. And we also know, and the article talks about, there's a pretty widespread shortage of nursing faculty. And so with all of those limitations at hand, it makes the operationalization even that much harder. Right.
Absolutely. Now, it's interesting to me, and I can draw corollaries between healthcare education and business, where oftentimes we take a successful sales representative and we make them a sales manager, if you will, even though they haven't, doing and teaching are very, very different. Now, you and your colleagues, you've lived through this. You've been a practicing nurse, and now you add this educational piece. So you've seen this firsthand, right? We just can't, even if you're the greatest nurse in the world, we just can't wave a magic wand and make you a brilliant educator, right? So there's a little bit of a challenge for somebody like yourself. What did you do as you were making that transition from nurse to nurse educator?
Yeah. So, one way to do that is when people go back for increased education and schooling, either through master's programs or doctoral programs, to focus on nursing education, where you are getting that more formal training on pedagogy and, writing test plans and coming up with test blueprints and writing objectives and, all of those things that seem like they're pretty obvious and pretty straightforward. But when you actually get into doing them, they're a lot more difficult and complicated than one might think. And so that's one way to formally address that gap, is through formal, nursing education, graduate and doctoral programs. But what ends up happening a lot, and I'm sure this happens in other health professions as well, is that a really strong clinician, an expert in their field as a clinician, because they are a good nurse or they are a good doctor, or they are a good physical therapist or whatever, they sort of get targeted for, hey, you'd be a great educator. You should come over and teach our students, and you should do this and you should do that. But what's interesting is that just because you're an expert in your clinical field doesn't mean that you're completely prepared and ready to educate. And so that's another thing that our article really pointed out, is that there can be a little bit of that role struggle a little bit, and that it's so super difficult. And I've talked to many people just in my own life and in my own colleagues saying, gosh, it's really hard to be the expert in clinical and be the person that everybody comes to and everybody looks for guidance and mentorship. And then to move over into the academic or into the education role and feel like you're a newbie all over again.
Right.
And so people have really discussed, shared those feelings with me of man, it's hard not to be the expert anymore and to be starting at the beginning again.
I almost feel like on this one, you and your colleagues almost opened a bit of a Pandora's box, because whenever we talk about, okay, are our students doing well? Okay, so let's look at the student outcomes. Let's see how they're doing against the competencies. But yet I think what you're saying is, well, if the students aren't performing well, it could be a problem with the material. Mm-hmm. It could be a challenge with the student, but you're also saying, well, what? it could also have something to do with the instructor, right?
That's right. That's right.
I guess my question is how do we even think about unraveling that knot to figure out when we see those gaps, are the gaps at the physician or at the instructor level or at the student level?
Yeah.
And I'm probably getting ahead of myself because it sounds like the paper says, well, first off, we should be looking at the teachers.
Right.
How we correct from there is up for debate, but that's kind of what you're saying, right? Is it may not be the student's fault or the material's fault if we don't get the results we want.
That's right. Or it can be a combination of things, right? Certainly in my own career, I have found that multiple things can be true.
Yeah.
And so it's not an either or maybe necessarily, but yeah, there definitely does need, and I'm not going to speak for other educators, but I can just speak for my own personal career in education. There definitely are those moments or those points in your career where you do have to be a little vulnerable and a little self-reflective and say, okay, if this isn't working, maybe there is something that I can do or that I can help bridge that gap for the students easier or that I can retweak or I can improve upon. And so that can be difficult to be self-reflective. I know that's been hard for me in my own personal journey. But again, I think if we all can kind of be open and self-reflective about those things, that's kind of what's going to be required to transition this kind of brand new philosophy and this brand new way of teaching our nursing students. Because again, we know there's this real thing called the academic practice gap, where we think we're preparing our nursing students in nursing school, and then they graduate and get to clinical practice, and there's still a lot of gaps. And so there has to be this combination of, okay, yes, what kind of ownership and what kind of accountability do the learners have to bridge that gap between academic and practice? But then also, what can we do as their educators to help them bridge that gap and transform the way that they learn to maybe better match or better mimic the way things are going to look when they get to practice? That's part of us. That's part of our responsibility of how we innovate their learning.
You also wrote about the study also points to mentorship and socialization as crucial for preparing nursing educators. And it's interesting to me, we hear about those terms a lot, mentorship being one of them. And it's one of those words that comes out almost touchy-feely soft, but it almost seems like you and your team are saying, no, it actually needs to be a formal practice, or at some level, we need to be recognizing that's a responsibility as well. How do you see us moving beyond recognizing the importance of mentorship and actually creating true effective mentorship programs that do elevate the nursing educators of tomorrow?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, we do need to move beyond it being an informal, sort of relationship where, you sort of sit in somebody's office and bounce questions off of them and ask advice, because their door's open and you just plop down in their chair for a few minutes. I mean, that's all great too. That informal guidance and relationship building and mentorship is also very important. But, I think what you could add to that is some type of formal aspect of that, where there are specific competencies, some specific topics, some specific areas of focus that those conversations, could and should focus on to help sort of form and mold those newer educators. So again, I think you can sort of make a combination of, yes, you can still have that relationship building, but have your topics maybe be a little bit more structured, but by some type of formal mentorship program where, you meet several times throughout an academic year, especially if it's someone's first or second year of teaching, and you've specifically focused on, those core competencies, even just, creating some sort of roadmap using the NLN's core competencies for nurse educators could be like a monthly topic or something like that.
Right. I think that works well. How does this all play out within the constraints of the existing system that we have? So we know, for instance, that there's a nursing shortage.
Yes.
We know that there is a shortage of nurse educators, and at a certain level, what this paper sort of indicates is we need to be doing more, or at the very least be doing different, which is tough to do in times when we've got some real constraints. Given that these shortage and the constraints that we see in the system, How realistic is it to expect these institutions to develop the additional time and resources to, whether that be faculty development, making sure that we're retaining the faculty that we do have? Is this practical right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's practical because it has to be. We have to find a solution for this for the nursing shortage and for the nursing faculty. And in order to retain and maintain and sustain the adequate workforce for nurse educators, it basically is required that we have to evaluate and reimagine what that looks like to better maintain and grow nurse faculty. And so, yes, as you mentioned, there are a lot of constraints. There are a lot of limitations, from number of people to budgets to time to, so the list could go on. But I think we're kind of at a tipping point where it is imperative that we really nurture and grow this new upcoming workforce of nurse educators. Because again, we can't continue to grow and educate new nurses without a really strong workforce behind it. So, what that means in terms of reevaluating priorities or reevaluating time or what that looks like. But I don't think we can really afford to just say like, well, there's too many constraints or there's not enough time, because then we're going to be, in an even worse shape than we currently are.
One of the things I just love about this show and every guest that we bring on is every one of them seems to be both very aware of all the challenges and constraints that we have, but yet just pathologically optimistic that we're going to knock them down one step at a time.
Right.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a really important topic. I'm curious, when you come out of a project like this, and you're someone who's written a lot, published a lot, you're doing a lot. Is there a next step for this one? Does it just go on the shelf, or does this lead into, okay, so where can we go next with this? Any thoughts on where you might go, whether it be more research in the topic or actually putting into place some of the recommendations that you and your colleagues came up with?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can answer it sort of in a twofold way. In terms of like more research, I think we do need to know more about the effect that measuring competencies, because the article really does show that there's very few studies out there that have actually measured the competencies of nurse educators. So if we could continue to look and explore ways that measure the competencies of nurse educators and what impact that has on student outcomes, that would be kind of the next step in terms of research, is the measurement of both competencies for educators and students. And then in terms of pragmatic kind of ways to actually implement this, it would be things like professional development, that we're focusing on those core competencies from the NLN. And then also, again, kind of as we've already touched on, robust and kind of structured development of mentorship programs. I think those would be kind of two of the two priorities that I would certainly focus on.
Wonderful. Laura, my final question for you is, it looks like if people have follow-up questions, you're active on LinkedIn. That's probably a great place to reach out to you.
Yeah.
And somebody like yourself, you're always doing presentations. You always have papers coming out. Anything that's coming up in the next few months we should have our eyes on?
Yeah. So we actually, I'm going to be doing a poster presentation at the AACN Transform Conference in December, talking about a competency-based curriculum that we piloted and implemented with our third-year students here at the School of Nursing. So that's something that's going to be coming up here that we're going to continue to push out. And again, it's back to that competency thing, right? Getting out there about how we measure and how we can really track competencies for our nursing students. So that should be coming up here in the next couple of months. There's
so much excitement right now, and I can feel the excitement from you. This idea of nursing moving more in that competency-based direction. It sounds like you and your colleagues feel extremely excited about it.
Yeah, we've definitely bought in, and I love that. Like I said, I love that it's tangible things, right? It's things that you can actually see your students doing and learning and having output, versus just, how many times in education are you like, well, I told them that, I taught them that, they should know that. Yeah, but can they actually do it? Can they actually perform? If they can, then we know that we're doing a good job, not just that we told them, And so I really buy into it. Like, it makes perfect sense and logical sense that would be the next step, is that we can ensure that we have observable outcomes of what our students have learned.
Outstanding. Dr. Laura Klenke-Borgmann, thank you so much for joining us today.
That was great. Thanks so much for the chat.
Wonderful. I'm going to take it out here. Listen, as our audience knows, healthcare education is complex, mercilessly complex sometimes, and for good reason. In fact, there are many reasons for this, but Occam's razor suggests that when you are deciphering complex problems, we're often served by examining the simplest solutions. And in this case, Laura and her colleagues are suggesting, well, we might get some improved student outcomes if we're paying more attention to, are the instructors actually able to teach those NLN core competencies for academic nurse educators? It's really hard to argue with that. It's a pretty simple solution. Moreover, as this entire industry moves to this change to competency-based learning, it's vital that our educators are doing the same as it relates to their own critical roles as we think about the education value stream. I want to thank today's guest, Dr. Laura Klenke-Borgmann. She is the Director of Simulation Education at the University of Kansas School of Nursing and a clinical associate professor. As she said, follow her on LinkedIn. She's got all sorts of great stuff coming out. You've been listening to MedEdge. For everyone on the MedEdge team, I'm Marcus Grimm.